Hello everyone and welcome to Compassion in Politics' new podcast series, What Matters, where each week we talk to a leading political thinker about the issues that matter most to them. My name is Jennifer Nadel and this week I'm incredibly excited to be joined by Guy Standing. Guy is Professor of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and his most recent book, Battling 8 Giants, makes the compelling case for a basic income. Guy Standing, thank you so much for joining us to talk about what matters. I want to start by asking you that big question. What matters most to you at the moment?
Well, I've been advocating basic income for the whole of my career, and we set up an international network called BIEN, Basic Income Earth Network. And for many, many years, we were mocked and regarded as either utopian or communist or some such epithet. And suddenly we've become respectable. And over the past 3 months of this pandemic, I've been inundated with inquiries from all over the world, and my books have been translated into 20 languages and that sort of thing. And I've had so many Zooms and media interviews because suddenly people are realizing that a basic income is almost an economic imperative. Many people are understanding that. I've always argued that it's an ethical issue fundamentally, but this pandemic means that we desperately need a model in which we have a comprehensive revision of our income distribution system as such, which I've been analyzing in my books over the years. And at the moment, I am really hopeful that enough people are going to come round to our perspective from different political starting points and understand, and this is your motto, I know, that this is a matter of compassion. It's not a matter of pity. It's not a matter of conditional welfare. It's a matter of establishing an economic right for everybody. And I think this is a moment of hope. It's not going to come easily. It's not going to come without a lot of struggle and setbacks, because conservative forces, and I mean that in both senses, are opposed to having a genuine, comprehensive system in which everybody has basic security as a fundamental right of freedom and citizenship. So I am passionately convinced that it's up to all of us to use this space, this tragic moment, to turn it into a moment where we emerge from this pandemic crisis and slump that's coming with a much better income distribution system as such.
So how would a basic universal income work in practice?
Well, let me first of all say that I don't use the term universal basic income because for pragmatic, practical reasons, you would have to have some restrictions on entitlement. You would be excluding non-resident citizens, for example, and you would have to have some sort of rule for migrants coming into the country, have to be in the country legally for a certain amount of time before they would be entitled to the basic income. That doesn't mean they wouldn't receive some income support, but from outside the basic income system. And what the idea is that everybody who qualifies for it would have a modest basic income paid individually, not by a household. It's very important, particularly for women, that it should be paid individually. and it would be paid unconditionally. In other words, you don't have to have made particular contributions or have to perform labor or offer to perform labor. All these tricks that are used in universal credit would have to go, and we would have it as an economic right. It goes back to the Charter of the Forest, November 1217, which was the same day as Magna Carta was sealed, which said basically that every free man has a right to subsistence. It was then England, but it applies to Britain, every part of the United Kingdom. And I think that this is justifiable on ethical grounds, on the grounds that the wealth and income of all of us is far more to do with the efforts and achievements of the many, many generations before us. And if you allow for private inheritance of private wealth, which is something for nothing, if you notice, then you should have a social dividend, because we don't know whose parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., contributed to our collective wealth. So in a sense, it would be a social dividend. And for me, that is fundamentally a matter of justice, common justice. You can also justify it, as I've shown in my books, by other justice principles. But I think fundamentally, it's a matter of equity and recognizing that we're all commoners in this country. And I think that that is a fundamental principle of a basic income system. I use the term basic income system because you would have to pay people with disabilities, people with frailties, who have extra costs of living and lower probable incomes, to give them an equal basic security to others, so that they would have to have separate supplements, but not be means tested. That's the failure of the current system, but be based on the fact that they have extra costs and they have certain disabilities which are medically
so that addresses the concern that some people have that a basic income would in some way be used to reduce welfare and essential support, for example, for those with disabilities.
Well, exactly. And I'm totally against that. And I don't believe that that would happen, because a basic income paid to everybody, and we found that in our pilots in various parts of the world, leads to stronger bargaining positions, leads to people being determined to fight for other rights. And I think it's just completely fallacious that giving benefits, whether it basic income or child benefits or any other benefits, would lead to a dismantling of the welfare state. That is pathetic reasoning. We need to have many forms of services and benefits, as well as a basic income. A basic income is an anchor, a core of a new system. And I think it's, Albert Hirschman wrote a very brilliant book about the rhetoric of reaction. And he pointed out that every progressive idea throughout history has been met by the same type of objections, that it would lead to the dismantling of other things. And then as soon as it's introduced, it becomes part of the architecture of society, and those objections fade away. I believe
there is always that inherent, absolutely, and there is always that inherent aversion to change whenever something new and radical and also potentially life-changing for so many millions on this planet is suggested. The other argument that that you must encounter the whole time is about affordability. How can we pay for it? How can our economy, especially when it's going into what could be the worst recession in 300 years, afford to pay that basic income?
Well, yeah, and that objection looks particularly stupid right now, because the government has been spending money as if it's confetti. They've been finding literally £200 billion to pay for all the measures that they've been introducing. I believe those measures are chronically inefficient. They are terribly regressive. I've just written several articles showing the regressive character. In other words, they're increasing inequality. They're not reaching the vast number of people who are the most vulnerable in our society. And any scheme of assistance in this pandemic that leaves out the really vulnerable people and groups is not going to be a solution, because they are going to be the people who have the highest instance of the pandemic, the virus, and other social illnesses going forward. For me, this is an objection that one should break into two parts. One, we can have an emergency basic income, which can be affordable by fiscal measures, just as the government is spending on the job retention scheme and other things. And it has to be thought of as a long-term structural change. And in my books, I've been proposing the building of a commons capital fund based on carbon taxes, based on levies, on incursions into our commons, to build up a capital fund, and that fund make investments in ecological sustainable sectors and so on. And as the fund builds up along the Norwegian pension fund lines, if you like, or the Alaska Permanent Fund, as it builds up, the capacity to pay out a basic income rises, and you can pay a gradually rising amount as a basic income and insulate that fund from other fiscal policies, income tax, VAT, whatever you want, conventional taxes. And I think that we need in Britain to realize that we need a fundamental fiscal reform to shift to taxing forms of wealth rather than earned incomes, because what has happened as a result of what I call rentier capitalism over the last 30, 40 years is that more and more of the income has flowed to the rentiers, the people who possess property. And as that's taken place, the amount of wealth has grown enormously. From in the 1980s, for example, the value of private wealth in Britain was equal to 300% of GDP, 300% of national income. Today, it's worth over 700%. And as people have noted, the value of wealth has increased during this pandemic of the top 20% of the population. And to add to the story, wealth inequality is much, much greater than income inequality. And if wealth rises relative to income and wealth inequality is greater than income inequality, gradually over time, as we've seen, total inequality has been terrifyingly growing. And it's in that context that we need to think of how to recycle the rentier part of wealth. And I've proposed various ways in my books on corruption of capitalism and plunder of the commons, how that can be done. I think it's eminently affordable, especially given the following fact, which is that the Treasury itself has calculated that there are 1,156 forms of tax relief, which are predominantly benefits for the wealthy. 1,156. And they can't estimate how much income is lost from all of those, but of the top 209, this is the Treasury's own estimates before the pandemic, the top 209, this Treasury sacrifices over 430 billion pounds a year. That money, if it was used to pay a basic income, we'd all be wealthy. I don't expect all of that to be available for paying a basic income, but you can certainly roll back 200 billion without any problems, because they are not contributing to economic growth. They are merely increasing inequalities. And we need to roll those back and use that money to give ordinary people supplements to a declining real wage system. That's why I say the failure is our income distribution system. In rentier capitalism as we have today, the share of national income going to those who perform labor is going down and down and down. It's the Bank of England has shown that. Others have shown that. It's not something that is sensibly contestable. And in that context, we need to really use this tragic moment and a huge pandemic slump, as you've just described, probably the worst economic slump for 300 years, to say, right, this is a moment when we have to restructure our economic system and our distribution system in order to get out of this. Because if we don't, then the rumblings of this crisis will be repeated and repeated. And that's the theme of my new book, which came out in March, ironically, because basically we have an incredibly fragile economic system, which is prone to shocks and collapses and bigger shocks and bigger collapses. And really the pandemic itself is only the trigger to this latest pandemic slump. If we had a more resilient economy, we wouldn't be in the total mess that we are today. But we do have a rentier system which is prone to shocks and collapses and will get worse unless we dramatically reform our distribution system.
Obviously, we now have a government that is very much focused on individual wealth rather than the commons. How do you think I'm so sorry, that's my puppy, everyone, that you can hear in the background who also wants to join the conversation.
No problem. I hope he agrees.
How do you bring the right along with your argument?
I think, yeah, that's a good question. I don't think you can really expect the libertarian class-based right to have the intelligence or the decency to come round. But I do think there are people on the political right who come to it, come to their politics, believing in a free market economy, believing in individualism. And I would say to them, if you genuinely believe in a free market economy, then a rentier system is the total denial of a free market economy. If you have an intellectual property rights system which guarantees the owners of patents and copyright monopoly income for 20 years, or in the case of pharmaceuticals, 40 years, when often those patents are the result of publicly funded research, ethically and from an economic model point of view, you can't justify that. You can't justify that. And I think that they need to appreciate that if they genuinely believe in a free market economy, then this is the opposite of it. And therefore they should try to make reforms that reduce the degree of inequality that flows from a rentier system. And in that context, they may well go back to someone like Milton Friedman, who was a very right-wing economist, as everybody knows, and one of the gurus of Margaret Thatcher. And he came round in his old age to, in fact, he joined our association, and he recognized that for a market economy to function well, everybody must have enough basic security to be able to make rational choices. And you could only have that if people have a basic income on which to fall back on, because otherwise they can't be rational. And it's unfair of us to expect people who are insecure and without resources to be rational. And I think that they should understand that. In my new book called Battling Eight Giants, one of the giants is that people feel insecure and are stressed. Now, stress, we know, causes a diminishing IQ, a loss of what the psychologists call mental bandwidth. And the loss of mental bandwidth means that their IQ goes down, short-term IQ, if you like, And if it's chronic for too long, it gets worse than that. And if you are subject to that sort of pressure, it's unfair of us as society to expect people to be rational and to be socially responsible as we would like. If people are insecure, they cannot be held responsible because of that mental crisis that follows from insecurity and stress. I think people on the right, if they're not purely class-driven, want to preserve privileges for their class, and they're genuine in talking about wanting a free society, must recognize that you can only have a free society if people have enough security to be irrational. So I think that you can appeal to certain members on the right, but they have to be the, let me put it bluntly, the more intelligent and less class-ridden types. And I'm afraid on the front bench of this government, there are too many class-based, superficial people, and not enough of the serious Tories of the old school, if you like, who could appreciate that in these unique circumstances, we've got to come up with something that uniquely deals with the problems. And that is why I think
we do have this promise to level up, don't we? And this would seem to fit very neatly within that agenda. If there's a genuine desire to level up, then a basic income.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is a typical PR term, level up. I mean, you know, it sounds great, but what the hell does it mean? It's an abstraction. You know, level up, level down, level through the middle. What's it mean? I mean, basically, if you're going to talk about principles, ethical principles, then you've got to put a floor to uncertainty, a floor to insecurity and stress. Allow people to feel full members of society. And if that's what they mean when they say level up, well, you know, that's fine. I mean, basically, it's unusual for the Tories to talk about leveling, but they don't mean leveling. But what they do mean are not quite clear, and I dare say they don't, because it's a nice slogan, and I don't see how they're going to do it unless they move in this sort of direction. Unless they dismantle rentier capitalism, bring in a basic income, increase the voice, the collective voice of all of us. And in a sense, this is your mandate, I know, that we've got to have stronger collective voice to have a better form of democracy. You can't pretend you are in favor of leveling up if you preserve the existing democratic system. It's just completely unrepresentative, it's unfair. The Conservative government got a landslide with just 29% electorate supporting them, 29%, and they get a landslide. Well, that's hardly defensible from a democratic point of view. So if you want to level up, let us level up politically as well by making sure that everybody's votes have a stronger chance of being respected, and have a deliberative democracy brought in with proportional representation and mechanisms so that we can have a better deliberative process, which we don't have at the moment. We have a system which is ruled by a minority. No government has been elected with majority in my lifetime, and there's no prospect with the existing system that will change. And therefore, you know, let's see what their actions are relative to the words. Leveling up, well, what's it mean? So, you know, I'm a bit skeptical, but when I hear about, you know, a better electoral system, I'll be impressed. When I hear about them giving income security to everybody without phony sanctions and things like that through universal credit, I'll be impressed. When I hear about the social services getting the revenue and the capacity rather than be depleted by a decade of austerity for which every single member of this government voted. And that is fundamentally important. Every single member of this government, including Boris Johnson, voted yet again and again and again for the austerity policies which left the country socially fragile, with a depleted National Health Service that has been privatized by stealth, whereby nearly £10 billion a year is given out to corporations to deliver services that should be run by the National Health Service, and where that has been continued with contracts for Deloitte and others that to provide services. This is not a system that I hear is being leveled up or leveled, whether up or down. And at the moment, the political rhetoric is out of sync with the needs, with the desires of ordinary people, and with a dangerous trend towards populism and all of that we see with Donald Trump and the Brexit debate, where simplicities are replacing sensible, informed, deliberative discussions without being manipulated by big money. So
you talk about, sorry to interrupt there. You mentioned the popularity of the idea with the public, and Compassion in Politics has run a number of surveys which show a very high level of support for a basic income. The most recent showed that 76% of the public, and this is across all political parties, would support a law that made it essential that the government ensure that everyone's basic needs are met. It feels like we are at a moment where there is consensus that we cannot have people without enough money to put food on the table or living perpetually in insecure accommodation. What can those who are listening now and who are saying, yes, I totally agree with everything that Guy's said, what can they do now, apart from obviously buy your book and join Compassion in Politics? What are there any practical steps they can take?
Yeah, I've actually got a whole chapter about what we should be doing, and I believe that all of us have to become active. I did a podcast for the Greens a few weeks ago. I said, well, look, we're getting to a situation where the Greens, even the new Liberal Democrat leadership, the SNP, the Plaid Cymru, various other groups are all in favor of basic income. We have a wonderful situation where over 70%, as you just said, in different polls, are in favor of a basic income. Our first opportunity is going to be the May local council elections next May. I would like them to be more opportunities before then, and I think we've got to make our voice heard. We've got to lobby, we've got to organize, we've got to join your organization, the Basic Income Conversation, other organizations that are promoting basic income, including Bien. We've got to organize, but imagine the situation if in those local elections, there was a campaign in which we had a one-page leaflet, 2 pages if you like, recto verso, saying, please vote for any party that proposes to supports basic income. Whichever party you favor, make sure that they support basic income, and please do not vote for any party which is opposed to basic income. Now, I think that would be a fantastic campaign because it's so important, it's so fundamentally important for ecological reasons, as I've argued, as well as distributional reasons, that we move in this direction. And I think enough people will say, that is a big enough issue that I'm going to turn out to vote. We all know that a very small percentage of people actually vote in local council elections, and it may motivate more people to turn out and to vote, because it's a potential opportunity to declare, no, we will not allow the status quo ante, going back to the old system, which has been waiting for an accident to happen, and this is the accident. We need to go forward. I think that would put the wind up both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. I was advisor to John McDonnell last year and the year before, and he favoured basic income. And some of the people who are now in the shadow cabinet told me right to my face many times, without needing to, that they supported basic income. But now that they are on the front bench of the shadow cabinet, they've gone dummy. They've lost their nerve. And I think we need to help them have stronger backbones. And that means putting pressure on the Labour Party as well as the Conservatives. We've got the Greens doing fantastically well in promoting it. We've got the SNP actually putting money to help prepare for pilots. And I think we've got to demand that there are pilots. This is the theme of my new book. If we can't have a national system, at least let the government have the decency to allow for pilots to see whether it would work as well as we believe. And I think we can put pressure on them to do that, because they're going to have to wind down this horrendously expensive and inefficient and regressive job retention scheme, which is subject to huge fraud, as I showed and wrote in an article this past week. And I think that we are in a moment where if we collectively, and that's where your organization and others got to come together and work together to put pressure on the mainstream politicians to change. We've got a young chancellor who has no big training. He has no big political experience. He worked for Goldman Sachs. He worked out of a tax haven for many years, who is not really mainstream in terms of understanding the economic system. And I think we need to put pressure on all of them in government. We have a prime minister who is all over the shop, but we need to put pressure onto them and say, listen, it's your future as well as ours that we move in this direction. Because if they don't, I think the social violence coming down the road will be something none of us should want.
Guy Standing, thank you so much for talking to us. And if you haven't yet read Guy's excellent book, Battling Eight Giants, please do, and educate yourself and join those. And there are many groups who are working together, as you mentioned, Guy, trying to push forward with basic income, which, as we've just said, the public want, and politicians on both sides are still sadly resisting. Thanks again for your time, Guy. Really good to speak to you. Huge thanks to Guy Standing for joining us to talk about what matters. Now, we're incredibly excited that next week we are trying a bit of an experiment. We will be recording our next podcast live on Zoom at 6 p.m. on Monday, the 6th of July. Do join us and become part of the conversation. We'll be talking to the philosopher Julian Baggini, author of 20 books on philosophy, Guardian columnist, and founder of the Philosopher's Magazine, about the current political landscape, how to make politics more compassionate, and what matters most to him. We hope you will join us. You can find details on our website, compassioninpolitics.com. Today's podcast was brought to you by Compassion in Politics, which is part of the Real Agenda Network, and you can subscribe to us on any of your favourite podcast providers. If you have any feedback, we would love to hear from you. You can find us online at compassioninpolitics.com. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to being back with you again soon.